Okay, there are 5 women who appear in the books of Joshua, Judges, and First Samuel, the first part of it. And the first one is Rahab, and Joshua sends spies to check out the city of Jericho. And Rahab, who is described as an innkeeper, although there's alternate translations of that, welcomes the spies in. She hides the spies. She tells the spies that she's heard of the Israelites and that she wants to save her family. And they agree that they will save her life when they invade. And she just needs to put a scarlet ribbon outside her window, and then they will know to save her family, since they're going to carry out the ban and kill everybody else in the city, which again is problematic, but Joshua and the judges feel that they're trying to wipe out this alternate worldview, this pagan worldview where we control the gods through our rituals. So Rahab is not an Israelite, but she becomes the hero in the book or in the story of the fall of Jericho. Deborah appears in the book of Judges, and 2 interesting things about her. She is described as a prophetess or a prophet, and Miriam is a prophet. There's a prophet later in the Bible, another woman named Huldah. So the fact that Israel had women who served in the prophetic role is important. And she's also a judge, and the judges were military leaders and religious leaders. So Deborah is a prophetess, but when the general of the Israelite army comes to her, Barak, she gives him instructions. It turns out that Barak doesn't want to go into battle without her, and she says, well, then you're not going to win the glory in this battle. And he says, that's fine. And they go out into battle, and the person who actually gains the glory in the battle is the next person on the list, and her name is Jael or Yael. And Yael is an Israelite woman. There is an enemy general taking refuge from the battle. She welcomes him into her tent. She puts a blanket over him to hide him. He asks for some water. She gives him a bowl of warm milk, and he falls asleep. And while he's asleep, she takes a tent peg and hammers it through his temple. And there's actually a poem that celebrates this gory death. The story is violent, and the book of Judges is violent, but the name Jael or Yael has kind of that sort of violent connotation to it. And I want to take a little side trip here. This guy is Moshe Dayan, Moses Dayan, who was an Israeli military leader both before World War II, during World War II. He fought for the British, and he was a commander in the Israeli fight for liberation against its neighboring Arab neighbors. He also served in the Suez-Sinai War as a commander, I think a tank commander or armored commander. And he was also a military leader during the Six-Day War back in 1967. And you can see from his patch that he obviously lost an eye. That was apparently during World War II. But he had a daughter, and he named her Jael. She later became a member of the military and served in the Israeli parliament for years. But there's only one Jael in the Bible, and the story behind her is pretty violent. So when you give your daughter a name like Jael, there's kind of a symbolism to it. He also had a son whom he named Ehud or Ehud, which apparently is a fairly common name. I did a quick image search, and sorry that I covered up one of these people. The 2 men on the right are both named Ehud, and both of these men actually served as prime minister of Israel during their time. Ehud Olmert in the center, and Ehud Barak on the far right. And they were both born back in the 1940s. So again, there's only one Ehud, only one Ehud in the Bible, and he appears in the book of Judges. He's left-handed. He hides a dagger under his cloak. He lies to get in to see the enemy king, and then he takes the dagger and sticks it into the fat belly of the king. So when you name your son Ehud, there's kind of a symbolism behind it. And the little caption here mentions Gaza. This is back in 2008. And we hear about the Gaza Strip, and we hear about the violence that continues in the modern state of Israel, in the territories of Palestine, what we call the Promised Land. And the word Palestine actually comes from the Philistines. And when we do the stories of Samson, he's fighting in Ekron and Gath and Gaza, and these are cities that are still there today. So there's some symbolic value. There's a tendency for us to sometimes read these Bibles and read these stories from the Bible, and we see them as kind of quaint, but they're pretty violent, and they kind of echo the sorts of things that continue to happen in that part of the world today. So Jael, she's known for killing an enemy general violently. Delilah, as I mentioned, Samson is fighting the Philistines or the Palestinians in Gaza. And as the story goes, Delilah tricks him into revealing the secret of his strength. Samson is a pretty flawed character. I hope that we will have time to read it, or you'll have time to read it as an extra credit. But Delilah tricks him out of revealing the secret of his strength, and Samson is eventually killed. And she fits into a stereotype, which I hope to have time later in the semester to talk about, that women in the Bible tend to fall into just a few narrow categories. And Delilah is one of them. She's a trickster. She's a sneaky woman. Jael could be seen that way. Maybe Rahab could be seen that way. One of the other stereotypes in the Bible is that the woman's prime role is to give birth to a child, that she's a baby maker or a baby mama. Matter of fact, Samson's mother, we don't even learn her name. We just learn that she's barren, and then she has a miracle child, dedicates him to God, and then she drops out of the story, like many women in the Old Testament. Hannah is a little bit stronger. She fits into the stereotype of a fertility goddess. She becomes the mother of Samuel, who is the last judge. He's a prophet who anoints the first kings. But the story of Hannah is a little more complex. She's barren and she gives birth, just like Rachel, just like Sarah, just like so many other women in the Old Testament. She dedicates her son Samuel to God and makes him a Nazirite, where he's not going to drink wine, he's going to let his hair grow long. Again, that's where the Rastafarian tradition comes from, about letting one's hair be a sign of their dedication to God. But one interesting part about the story of Hannah is that when she finds out that she's going to have a child, she says this lengthy prayer, what's known as the Magnificat, where she celebrates God lifting up the lowly and God tearing down the powerful, God feeding the hungry and sending the rich away empty, God being on the side of the oppressed and God tearing down the oppressor. And that prayer of Hannah when she's expecting a child is echoed in the New Testament in the prayer of Mary. Mary's prayer is the Magnificat, which has the same theme: God lifting up the lowly, God tearing down the mighty. So that connection to the New Testament is important for us as Christians to see that there's a prologue. Speaking of the New Testament, if you open to the first chapter of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, it begins with this long genealogy, this long list of people. And Matthew is writing for a very Jewish audience, so he assumes that his audience is very familiar with Israel's history and main figures. And in a typical genealogy, you would list all the men who were the ancestors of somebody. So this story begins with Abraham, who's the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and the other 12 sons, and blah, 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 blah. And then, quite surprisingly, Matthew throws in that Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, and that their mother was Tamar. And you kind of scratch your head and go, why did Matthew suddenly throw in a woman? And why did he specifically throw in the name of this woman? He doesn't mention Sarah or Rachel or Leah, but then tosses out this name Tamar. And then one goes down a little bit further and one sees that there's some other women who have been inserted into Matthew's genealogy, Matthew's family tree of Jesus. And one of them is Rahab, who was seen as the mother of Boaz. And you think, oh, Rahab's in the family tree of David, or Rahab's in the family tree of Jesus? That's kind of an interesting woman to mention. And then it says Boaz was married to Ruth and another woman. And you think, oh, there's something kind of scandalous about Ruth, too. Hopefully, we'll have time to do that story. It is inserted in the Bible between 1 Samuel, between Judges and 1 Samuel, but it doesn't really fit with the Deuteronomic history there. But Rahab and Ruth are very interesting women. And then at the end of this little passage, it says, oh, by the way, Bathsheba was the mother of Solomon, and she had been the wife of Uriah, or which is opening up another can of worms, because these are rather scandalous women. I can't go into them all right now, but the fact that Matthew puts women into the family tree of Jesus who did something to make sure that the family continues, and women who might be considered a bit scandalous, I think is important, because Jesus was born to Mary, and Mary was an unwed teenage mother, and the birth of Jesus might be considered something scandalous. And so Matthew is painting a picture here that the birth of Jesus fits in with the family tree of King David and fits in with the history of ancient Israel. That sometimes there are women like Ruth and like Rahab and like Bathsheba and like Tamar from Genesis, not the one from 2 Samuel, that are scandalous, yet they did something important to keep the family tree going. So Ruth, Bathsheba, and Tamar are not going to be on our next quiz. Or ask me in class if you really want me to clarify. Just the first 5 should be enough.